fell in love with the handwriting before I ever saw his face, and the scariest part was realizing he might have been right beside me every single day. They assigned us the same locker because the school had run out of space. No warning, no explanation, just a small printed slip handed to me at orientation, with a number stamped on it and two names listed underneath, mine and someone else's, a stranger I had never met, but was suddenly expected to share something small and personal with. And as I stood in the hallway on the first day of school staring at that narrow metal door, dented from years of careless backpacks and rushed mornings, I remember wondering how two lives were supposed to fit into something that barely felt big enough for one. I opened it carefully, slowly, like I was stepping into someone else's space, sliding my books to one side, adjusting my notebook so they would not spill, already feeling like I was apologizing to someone I had never spoken to, and then I closed it and walked away without thinking much of it because, at the time, it was just a locker, just another inconvenience in a crowded school. The first note appeared on a Tuesday, folded once, tucked awkwardly between my English book and the metal wall, and it was not romantic or clever or dramatic. It simply said, "Sorry if my math book keeps falling on your shoes," and I do not know why that made my chest feel warm, but I smiled before I even realized I was smiling, standing alone in the hallway with lockers slamming around me, holding a piece of paper that suddenly felt important. I wrote back without overthinking it, scribbling quickly during lunch, folding the paper the same way, and slipping it back into the locker with a small, nervous laugh. It is okay, I trip over my own feet anyway, and that should have been the end of it, just a polite exchange between two students forced into sharing a space. But the next day, there was another note, smaller this time, neater, asking what class do you hate the most, and I found myself answering honestly, like the locker was listening, like the paper could keep secrets. History, I wrote. Too many dates, not enough feelings. His reply came the same afternoon, folded carefully, waiting for me like he knew exactly when I would open the door. "I like English," it said. Words make more sense when they are written, and something about that sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, echoing in my head even after I walked away. We never signed our names, never asked who the other was, and somehow that silence felt safer. Like anonymity gave us permission to be honest without fear. And the notes became a daily habit, sometimes about school, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about things I had never said out loud to anyone. I told him I felt invisible most days, and he wrote back that some people shine quietly. I told him I was scared of being ordinary, and he said ordinary was underrated, and honesty was rare, and without realizing it, I started opening the locker slower, my heart beating faster each time, just in case a new note was waiting. I began writing drafts at night, crossing out sentences, choosing which version of myself I wanted to leave folded between textbooks. And even though I did not know his face, or his voice, or his name, I knew his handwriting better than my own. And somehow, quietly, impossibly, that felt like enough. Do you think emotional connection can matter more than physical attraction? By the second week, the locker no longer felt like a shared inconvenience, but like a quiet meeting place that existed only for us. A narrow metal space where his words waited for me every morning, and I started timing my walks between classes so I could be the first one there, just to feel that small rush of relief when I saw a folded piece of paper resting where my books used to lean. The notes grew longer, the handwriting more familiar, and I learned the way he pressed harder on certain letters when he was thinking, the way his sentences curved slightly upward, like he was hopeful even when he wrote about bad days. And I realized one afternoon, standing there with my back against cold metal lockers, that I could recognize his handwriting anywhere, even without his name attached to it. He asked me what made me feel calm, and I told him about rainy afternoons and empty classrooms and songs that felt like secrets. And he wrote back that he liked late nights when everyone else was asleep, because the world felt honest then, and every exchange felt like a door opening just a little wider. Sometimes I caught myself wondering who he was, scanning faces in the hallway, listening to laughter that lingered too long, watching hands as they scribbled notes in class, but I always stopped myself before curiosity turned into something dangerous because not knowing felt safer, because not knowing meant nothing could break what we were building between lines of ink. There were days when the note was missing, and those were the hardest days when I opened the locker and felt a strange emptiness settle in my chest. And I would tell myself he was busy, that this was silly, that I should not care this much about a stranger's handwriting. But then the next day, the note would be there again, apologizing for being late, and relief would wash over me like I had been holding my breath without realizing it. We talked about fears without naming them, about dreams without making promises, and I told him I wanted to leave this town someday, that I wanted more than familiar streets and predictable endings, and he wrote back that he felt the same, that sometimes he stared at maps during class imagining himself somewhere else. And in that moment, it felt like we were already traveling together, even if we never walked side by side. I noticed how his words changed when he was tired, shorter sentences, softer lines, and I started leaving him encouragement without being asked. Little reminders that his thoughts mattered, that someone was listening, and when he thanked me, his gratitude felt heavier than it should have, like he was holding something fragile. Without seeing his face or hearing his voice, I began to feel understood in a way I never had before, like he saw the parts of me I usually kept quiet, and every time I folded another note and slid it into the locker, I felt like I was leaving a piece of myself behind, trusting him to hold it gently. I did not realize it then, but somewhere between borrowed space and shared silence, I had started falling for the boy who lived in my locker. Would you want to know who they are, or would you protect the mystery a little longer? By the third week, the hallway itself seemed to conspire against the anonymity we were trying so hard to protect, because everywhere I went, I started noticing him, or at least noticing people who could be him. Boys leaning against lockers with familiar posture, hands folded the way I imagined his might be, laughter that sounded like it could belong to someone who knew how to write so gently. One afternoon, I arrived at the locker at the same time as someone else, a boy I recognized from my English class, and for a brief, terrifying moment, our hands almost touched as we both reached for the door, and I froze, my heart racing, wondering if this was it, if the mystery was about to unravel in the middle of a crowded hallway. But he stepped back politely, smiled, and said, "Sorry," and I realized he was not opening the locker. He was only passing by. I wrote about it that night, about how close I had come to knowing him, and the next day his response was waiting, telling me that he had moments like that too, moments when he thought he had found me, moments when curiosity almost won, but fear always stepped in at the last second. Because knowing could change everything, and not knowing was the only thing keeping us safe. There were near misses everywhere after that. Moments when I saw a boy linger too long at the locker when I walked away. Moments when I arrived early and felt eyes on my back, and every time I wondered if he was standing right there, watching me without me realizing it, carrying all those words inside him while pretending to be just another face in the crowd. He told me he liked watching people without being noticed, that it made him feel like he understood them better, and I told him I did the same, that sometimes I imagined stories for strangers just to feel less alone. And in that quiet confession, I felt closer to him than I did to anyone I spoke to out loud. Then one day he mentioned a girl, just briefly, just one line folded between sentences, saying that someone in his class laughed loudly and made him nervous. And even though he did not say her name, something twisted inside my chest, sharp and unexpected, and I hated myself for feeling it, because I had no right to jealousy over a boy whose face I did not even know. I did not mention it in my reply, choosing my words carefully, pretending the sentence had not lingered with me all day. But that night, I lay awake wondering if she knew him the way I did, if she had seen his smile, if she had heard his voice, things I only imagined but suddenly wanted desperately to claim. The next note he left was longer than usual, explaining that he felt guilty for even noticing someone else, that what we shared felt real in a way that confused him. And reading that, I felt relief and fear collide inside me because it meant he cared, and caring meant we were already crossing lines we pretended did not exist. I started to realize that anonymity was no longer protecting us. It was only delaying the moment when feelings demanded faces. And as I folded my next note and slid it into the locker, my hands were shaking. Because for the first time, I was not sure. I wanted the mystery to last forever. Is it fair to feel jealous over someone you have never met? After that confession, the notes felt heavier, like each piece of paper carried more than words. And every time I opened the locker, I felt the weight of what we were not saying. Because once feelings had names, even unnamed ones, it became harder to pretend we were just two strangers passing time. He started asking quieter questions, not about classes or music or favorite places, but about me, about what I was afraid of losing, about what I hoped people saw when they looked at me. And answering those questions felt like stepping into open air after holding my breath for too long, because no one had ever asked me things that required honesty instead of quick replies. I told him I was afraid of being forgotten, of being someone people only remembered when they needed something, and he wrote back that he already remembered me in ways that mattered, that my words stayed with him long after he folded the paper and put it away. And reading that made my chest ache in a way that felt dangerously close to hope. Sometimes he left notes with nothing but a sentence, something small and personal, like, "Today felt heavy, but your handwriting makes it lighter." And I would read it again and again until the hallway noise faded, and it felt like we were the only two people in the building. But the closer we grew, the more obvious the distance between us became, because I still did not know where he sat in class or what his voice sounded like or if I had walked past him without realizing it. And one afternoon, after a particularly long note from him about feeling torn between curiosity and fear, I finally wrote the question we had both been avoiding. Do you ever wonder what happens if we find out who we are? I folded the paper carefully, slid it into the locker, and walked away before I could change my mind, my heart racing with every step, because that single question felt like it could end everything or turn it into something real. The next day, there was no note, and the absence felt louder than anything he had ever written. And I told myself not to panic, that this was my fault, that I had pushed too far, and all through class, my thoughts circled around that empty space where his words should have been. When I finally opened the locker the following morning, my hands were cold, my stomach tight, and there it was, a folded note waiting for me like nothing had changed, except everything had. "I wonder about it all the time," he wrote. "I just do not know if knowing would ruin what we already have. Because right now we are honest, and once faces enter the story, expectations follow, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that." I pressed the paper against my chest without thinking, feeling the truth of his words settle in me because he was right. Anonymity had given us freedom, but it had also started to feel like a wall, and I knew then that eventually we would have to choose between staying safe or stepping forward. As I wrote my reply, promising that we would not rush, that we would protect whatever this was for as long as it felt right, I realized something quietly terrifying. I did not just like him anymore, I was afraid of losing him. Would you risk losing something beautiful just to know the truth? Once the question had been asked and carefully set aside, the rhythm of our notes changed in ways I did not expect. Not in how often we wrote, but in how much we held back. Because even when we promised not to rush, the awareness of what we were avoiding sat quietly between every sentence. He still left notes for me every day, but sometimes they felt cautious, like he was choosing safety over honesty, and I caught myself doing the same, rereading my words before folding them, wondering if I was revealing too much or not enough. And for the first time since this had begun, writing started to feel risky instead of comforting. There were days when I wanted to tell him about small things, like how I smiled when a song reminded me of his handwriting, or how I imagined his laugh during boring lectures, but I stopped myself, afraid that wanting him too openly would tip the balance and force us toward a truth neither of us felt ready to face. The silence grew in strange places, not in missing notes, but in pauses between thoughts. And I noticed how his replies sometimes arrived later than usual, how his handwriting seemed rushed, uneven, and even though he never said it, I could feel the weight of something pulling at him from the outside world. Then one afternoon, I overheard a group of girls talking near the lockers, laughing about someone who always lingered there after class, someone who spent too much time staring at the metal doors like he was waiting for a miracle, and my heart started racing as I wondered if they were talking about him, if the world was getting too close to our secret. That night, I wrote without thinking, asking if everything was okay, if something had changed, and the next day, his reply came quickly, almost urgently, saying he felt stretched thin, pulled between expectations and the quiet space we shared, and that he was afraid of disappointing people he could not see. Reading that, I realized how deeply I had become part of his emotional world and how deeply he had become part of mine. Because his stress felt personal, like it was happening to both of us, and I hated that I could not do anything more than leave words on paper. I told him he did not owe anyone anything, that what we had mattered, even if it stayed hidden. And he thanked me, saying my notes were the calmest part of his day, and those words should have made me happy, but instead they scared me. Because I was no longer just someone he talked to, I was becoming someone he depended on. The next time I opened the locker and saw his familiar handwriting waiting for me, I felt both comforted and afraid, because I understood then that silence was no longer our biggest threat. It was how much we meant to each other without knowing who we were. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet thought began to form, a thought I was not ready to write down yet, that if this ended without a face or a name, it might hurt more than if we had never started at all. Can emotional dependence form even without physical presence? The shift happened so quietly that I did not notice it at first, because there was still a note waiting for me most mornings, still familiar handwriting folded carefully between books, but something in his words had started to feel distant, like he was standing farther away even while speaking to me. His sentences grew shorter, more careful, and sometimes they sounded tired, and I found myself rereading them, searching for meanings that might not have been there, wondering if I'd said something wrong, if the pressure of our unasked question had finally become too heavy for him to carry. One Friday, I opened the locker and found nothing. No folded paper, no apology, no sign that he had even been there, and the emptiness hit me harder than I expected. Because by then, his notes had become part of my routine, something I leaned on without realizing how much I needed it. I told myself not to panic, that everyone has bad days, that he would write later. But all through class, my thoughts kept drifting back to that empty locker. And by the end of the day, my chest felt tight with worry I could not explain to anyone else. The next morning, there was still nothing. And that was when fear settled in, quiet and heavy, because 2 days of silence felt different than one. And for the first time, I considered the possibility that he might be gone for good, that something had happened, or worse, that he had chosen to walk away without saying goodbye. That night, I wrote anyway, even though I did not know if he would ever read it, telling him that I hoped he was okay, that he did not have to disappear to protect himself, that his words mattered to me more than he knew, and folding that note felt like letting go of something fragile into the dark. Monday morning, I walked to the locker slower than ever before, bracing myself for disappointment. And when I opened it and saw his handwriting waiting for me, relief washed over me so fast it almost hurt, my hands shaking as I unfolded the paper. "I am sorry," he wrote. "I needed space because I was scared of how much this matters to me, and reading that made my heart ache, because I understood that fear more than I wanted to admit, the fear of caring deeply without a safety net, the fear of losing control." He explained that prom was coming up, that everyone around him was pairing off, asking questions, making plans, and it made him feel like what we had existed outside the world, beautiful but invisible, and that invisibility was starting to feel lonely. I pressed the note to my chest, feeling the truth of it settle in because prom had been floating around my thoughts too, an unspoken reminder that real moments required real presence. And as I wrote my reply, promising that he was not alone in feeling this way, I realized something had shifted. This was no longer just a quiet exchange of words, it was a fragile connection standing at the edge of something real. And whether we stepped forward or pulled away, I knew nothing would ever feel the same again. Would you wait for someone who might disappear again? After he mentioned prom, it stopped being a distant idea and started feeling like a ticking clock, because suddenly there was a date attached to all the things we'd been avoiding, a night that demanded faces, names, and choices, and no amount of folded paper could keep that reality away forever. We did not talk about it right away, choosing instead to circle around the subject with safer words, but even our silence carried meaning now, and every note felt like it was leaning toward a decision we were both too careful to make. Then one afternoon, he wrote that he was tired of pretending, not of us, but of acting like what we shared was smaller than it felt, and reading that made my hands tremble because it was the closest he had ever come to admitting that this was more than comfort or distraction. I replied honestly, telling him that I was scared too, that I liked him in a way that felt real and vulnerable, and that the thought of seeing his face made my heart race in both excitement and fear, and for a moment after folding that note, I just stood there, breathing slowly, knowing I had crossed another invisible line. The next day, his response was waiting, longer than usual, written carefully like he had taken his time with every word, and he asked me something that made the hallway disappear around me. What if we met at prom without knowing it was each other? I read the sentence again and again, my mind racing with possibilities, imagining dancing next to him without realizing it, laughing with someone whose words I already loved, and the idea felt both romantic and cruel, because it meant the truth would still be hidden, even when we were standing in the same room. I wrote back that I was not sure I could handle that I wanted the moment to matter, not to be another near miss, and he understood, telling me that he felt the same, that if we were going to cross that line, he wanted it to be intentional. Slowly, cautiously, We began narrowing things down, not names or faces, but details that felt safe enough to share, like what color he planned to wear, like where he might stand if he felt overwhelmed. And I told him the dress I had been saving, the one I had never planned to wear for anyone. With every shared detail, the space between us shrank, and I started noticing the world differently, paying attention to boys who matched his descriptions, wondering if I'd brushed past him without knowing, and the thought made my chest feel tight with anticipation. By the end of the week, we made a quiet agreement, one that existed only between us and the locker that had brought us together, that on prom night we would leave one final note, a description, a sign, something that would let us recognize each other without words. As I folded that note and slid it into place, my hands shaking, I realized that the mystery that had once protected us was finally giving way to hope. And whether that hope led to something beautiful or something heartbreaking, I knew I was ready to find out. Would you meet them at prom or keep the mystery alive? Prom night arrived faster than I expected, wrapped in music and nerves and a dress that felt heavier than it should have because it was carrying weeks of words, secrets, and hopes that had never been spoken out loud. And as I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my hair, all I could think about was whether he would recognize me before I recognized him. Before leaving the house, I stopped by the school one last time, my heart pounding as I opened the locker that had become more important to me than I was ready to admit. And there it was, the final note, folded neatly, waiting for me like it always had. And for a moment, I just held it, breathing slowly, afraid that reading it would make everything real. He had written a simple description, nothing obvious, nothing that would give him away too easily, just enough for me to find him if I paid attention. Navy jacket, standing near the edge of the room when the music gets loud, pretending not to watch but always watching, and reading it made my chest ache because it sounded exactly like the boy I had imagined. I wrote mine quickly, my hands shaking as I described the dress, the way I would keep touching the bracelet on my wrist when I felt nervous, and sliding that note into the locker felt like sealing a promise we could no longer take back. The gym was transformed when I arrived, lights soft and golden, music echoing off the walls, couples laughing and posing for pictures, and as I stepped inside, I felt strangely alone, scanning faces, searching for familiarity in strangers, wondering if he was already there doing the same thing. Every boy in a navy jacket made my heart jump. Every quiet smile felt like it could belong to him, and I moved slowly through the room, aware of every sound, every glance, every moment that felt like it might be the one. At one point, I thought I saw him standing near the edge of the dance floor, just like he had written, and my breath caught as I moved closer, my heart racing with the thought that this was it. But as he turned, I realized he was someone else, and disappointment washed over me so sharply that I had to step away. Minutes passed, then more, and doubt began to creep in, whispering that maybe he had changed his mind, that maybe he was watching me from somewhere else, or maybe he was not there at all, and the thought made my chest tighten with fear. Then, across the room, I saw someone adjust the bracelet on his wrist, a small, nervous gesture that mirrored my own, and in that quiet moment, everything around me seemed to fade because suddenly the world felt very small, and I knew I was standing at the edge of the truth. Would you walk toward them, or wait for them to notice you? I stood there longer than I should have, watching him adjust that bracelet again, my heart pounding so loudly that it felt like the music could not possibly drown it out, because in that small, familiar gesture, I saw every note he had ever written, every pause, every careful sentence that had slowly become part of me. I took a step forward, then another, moving through the crowd like I was walking through water, aware of every second stretching longer than it should have, and when he finally looked up and our eyes met, something in his expression changed, recognition flickering there even before understanding fully formed. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because there were no words prepared for this, no folded paper to soften the truth, just two people standing in front of each other carrying weeks of quiet honesty, and I wondered if he could see it on my face, the same fear and hope tangled together. Then he smiled, small and unsure, the kind of smile that felt familiar even though I'd never seen it before, and he said my name softly, not because he had known it all along, but because he had finally asked someone nearby before I reached him, and hearing it out loud made my chest ache in a way I was not ready for. I laughed, nervous and breathless, and asked him if he had been standing near the edge of the room pretending not to watch, and when he nodded, relief washed over both of us at the same time, because suddenly the pieces fit together in a way that felt almost unreal. We talked, slowly at first, like we were learning how to exist in the same space, matching the voices to the words we already knew by heart, and I was surprised by how natural it felt, how his voice sounded exactly the way I had imagined, calm and careful, like he chose his words even when he spoke. He told me he recognized my handwriting long before he recognized my face, that he had noticed the bracelet too, and hearing that made me smile so hard my cheeks hurt because it meant the connection had been real in both directions. When he asked me to dance, it felt less like a question and more like a continuation, and as we moved together slowly, the world around us blurred, replaced by the quiet certainty that what we had built had survived the truth. Still, there was a softness to the moment, a caution, because neither of us wanted to rush something that had grown so gently, and as the song ended, I realized that this was not an ending at all, but the beginning of learning each other beyond the locker, beyond the notes. As we stood there, close but not quite touching, I knew that no matter what happened next, the girl who had fallen in love with handwriting had finally met the boy who had written her into something braver. Do you think meeting them made the love stronger or more fragile? After prom, nothing about us changed all at once, and yet everything felt different. Because now when I saw him in the hallway, there was no guessing, no wondering, just a quiet smile that carried weeks of shared words behind it. We did not suddenly become loud or dramatic or obvious. We moved carefully, the way people do when they know something precious could still be fragile. And sometimes we still left notes in the locker, even though we no longer needed to, because it felt wrong to let that space go completely. The locker stayed where it always had, dented and narrow and ordinary to everyone else, but to us, it was proof that something small could hold something big. That connection did not need grand beginnings to matter. There were moments when we laughed about how close we had been without knowing, about how we might have passed each other hundreds of times carrying the same feelings in silence, and those moments felt surreal, like remembering a dream that had somehow become real. We talked more now, about the future, about fears, about the things we had once only written, and sometimes he would tell me that my voice sounded just like my handwriting, and I would tell him that his smile matched the kindness in his words, and in those quiet exchanges, I felt something settle inside me, something steady. One afternoon, weeks later, as the year began to slow toward its ending, I opened the locker and found one final note waiting for me, written in the handwriting that had changed everything, and it simply said, "Thank you for seeing me before you saw me." I held that paper for a long time, because in that sentence was everything we had been: the anonymity, the trust, the courage it took to fall for someone without knowing who they were, and I wrote back one last time, folding the paper carefully like I always had. "Thank you for writing to me when you did not have to." We closed the locker together after that, not because the story ended there, but because it had outgrown that space. And as we walked down the hallway side by side, I realized something that made me smile. I had fallen in love with the handwriting first, yes, but what it really taught me was that love begins when someone listens, when someone responds with care, when someone chooses honesty even in the quietest places. And every time I pass that row of lockers now, I still slow down just a little, remembering how my first love began, not with a face, but with a folded note and a shared space between two strangers who decided to be honest. Do you think love finds us, or do we write our way into it?